Good evening and welcome to the final event for this year, this first year of the Africana Studies Project, Insurgent Intersections, Combating Global Anti-Blackness. Before we get started, I do want to let everybody know that we have live transcript enabled. So if you would like that service, just hover down on the bottom menu and you'll be able to turn that on so that we can be accessible to everybody. So welcome again. My name is Dr. Kim Butler. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. And I'm one of the project directors of Insurgent Intersections that we just talked about. As we welcome you all in tonight, I would like to invite my partners in this project, my partner directors, to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Akisi Britton, and I am an assistant professor in the Africana Studies Department at Rutgers University, New Brunswick.
Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Shanti Rosado. I'm an assistant professor in Africana Studies and Latino and Caribbean Studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick. And I'm so excited to have you all here.
And yes, we're really delighted to be here with you all tonight and be together. And my partners and I, along with our support from the Department of Africana Studies, created this project as a multi-year project to examine the particular importance of Blackness for understanding the mechanisms of social injustice. Moving through a series of themes ranging from the deep roots of anti-Blackness to its multiple manifestations, and eventually to the ultimate goal of healing, we are especially interested in the lessons gleaned from Black experience that can chart a path towards solutions and equity. Tonight, we're going to be sharing some highlights from this year's exploration of our theme, the roots of global anti-Blackness. Tonight, we're going to start out with hearing from excerpts of the keynote address from this October that was given by Dr. Leslie Alexander, as introduced by her sister, Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow. We'll also hear from the scholars who developed works in progress in our spring workshops. And then we're going to be moving on to some live conversations with scholars working at the intersections of activism, arts, and scholarship, where you'll also have a chance to participate with your own questions. Before moving on to our program, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our partners and supporters who have made this project possible. We thank the Rutgers Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice and its director, Michelle Stevens, the Scarlet and Black Center and its director, Erica Armstrong Dunbar, and the Department of Africana Studies and our chair, Dr. Edward Ramsamy. All of you have provided critical funding for this year's activities and project startup funds that have made Insurgent Intersections a reality. We did a wonderful collaboration with the Black Latin Americas xLab at the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies, directed by our colleague Omari Zamora, which brought Dr. Pablo José López Oro as a special guest this spring. And we are especially grateful to our graduate partner, Jenny Jiang, who has expertly managed all the multiple aspects of running this project with creativity, professionalism, grace, and good humor. Jenny, we could not have done this without you. And thank you, everyone who's here tonight, for taking time out of what is always an insanely busy month of April in academia to help us think about how we need to show up around the very serious business of anti-Blackness that cannot be ameliorated. We are about the business of eradicating it altogether by whatever means necessary. Thank you.
As we organized this program this year, there were some broad questions that we wanted to work with, that we wanted to think through, that we wanted to bring about new insight into. Some of those questions include, how did gender inform the structuring of anti-Blackness? How did anti-Blackness evolve in conjunction with other systems of oppression? How is anti-Blackness a global phenomenon? And what are the historical roots of some of today's struggles against anti-Blackness? With these questions in mind, Insurgent Intersections invited Dr. Leslie Alexander to give our keynote address, since her new work directly addresses some of these issues. In her forthcoming book, Fear of a Black Republic, Haiti and the Birth of Black Internationalism in the United States, Dr. Alexander examines how laws and practices during slavery have shaped modern day practices of policing, incarceration, and vigilante violence against contemporary Black communities. Dr. Leslie Alexander frames these practices in the global context of the Haitian Revolution, in the global context of anti-Blackness and the fear of Black liberation, in her discussions of the connections between the Haitian Revolution and the growth of policing and vigilante violence against Black people in the United States. And now we would like to share with you some clips from Dr. Alexander's keynote address that she gave last October, and who, as Kim noted, was introduced by her sister, Dr. Michelle Alexander, who together they co-wrote the essay titled Fear in the 1619 Project, A New Origin Story, published just last year.
The essay that Leslie and I co-wrote explores Black rebellion, repression, and the deadly consequences of white fear of Black liberation. Together, we aim to show that the specific forms of repression and control may have changed over time, but the underlying pattern established during slavery has remained the same. Modern day policing, surveillance, and mass criminalization, as well as white vigilante violence and know your place aggression, have histories rooted in white fear, not merely of Black crime or Black people, but of Black liberation.
So how did we get here? Since I'm a historian, I'm sure no one will be surprised to find out that I believe we need to deeply examine our history, nationally and globally, in order to fully understand. And based upon my research thus far, my central argument is this. Since the founding of this nation, Black strivings for liberation have been demonized, criminalized, and subjected to persecution, while white people's demands for liberty, even when utterly misguided, are deemed rational, legitimate, and largely unthreatening. There has never been a time in American history when Black people's quest for freedom and equality did not spark existential fear among white people, frequently leading to a violent response. A deep-seated, gnawing terror that Black people might one day rise up and demand for themselves the same freedoms and inalienable rights that led white colonists to declare the American Revolution has shaped American politics, culture, and systems of justice ever since. Even when Black resistance has been largely peaceful or purely symbolic, such as fists raised during the medal ceremony at the 1968 Olympics, or a knee taken on a football field during the Pledge of Allegiance more than 50 years later, any sign of rebellion has typically resulted in threats or acts of violence perpetrated by white vigilantes, militia groups, and the police, often culminating in the creation or strengthening of systems of social and racial control. The reflexive impulse to respond to Black people's freedom dreams with severe retribution is traceable to the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, when white people desperately sought to control a large unfree population who refused to submit to their enslavement. At the heart of slavery lay a terrifying conundrum, an epic struggle between the slaveholders who sought to extract labor, loyalty, and submission from their human property, and the enslaved people who longed for liberty and were willing to obtain their liberation by any means necessary. In 1669, the Carolina colony granted every free white man, quote, absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves. Within decades, Carolina law drastically bolstered white authority, expanding authority not just to legal slaveholders, but to the white population more generally. Carolina law soon mandated that all whites, regardless of whether or not they owned slaves, ought to be responsible for policing Black people's activities. Those who failed to do so or refused to do so were subject to substantial fines. Really, the core of my argument is that this notion that white people possessed absolute power and authority over Black people, and that all whites were responsible for policing Black people and monitoring anything they deemed suspicious, undergirded every slave code that followed and ultimately defined the nature of race relations in America. By the late 1720s, slave patrolling in South Carolina had become a fundamental part of the militia's regular duties. Virginia and North Carolina soon created their own slave patrols, and by the mid-18th century, colonial authorities transformed white settlers, who, by the way, were recruited and handsomely rewarded, into a militarized law enforcement organization that was primarily engaged in watching, catching, or brutally punishing Black people. Now, everywhere, the pattern was the same. As Black people sought freedom, white fear morphed into a murderous rage, followed by heightened surveillance, violent patrolling, and new waves of laws or policies that sought to subdue the enslaved population. During the colonial era, this pattern culminated on September 9th, 1739 in South Carolina, when 20 enslaved Africans revolted near the Stono River, some 20 miles southwest of Charleston. After raiding a local store where they grabbed weapons and ammunition, they marched from plantation to plantation, killing nearly 30 slaveholders as they burned and seized their property. Using drums and other musical instruments, the rebels attracted additional supporters, and soon the uprising blossomed to more than 100. When the local militia caught wind of the attacks, they hunted down the rebels and successfully squashed the rebellion. South Carolina officials eventually arrested more than 150 Black people, publicly executing and hanging 10 people each day. Their heads were displayed on massive wooden poles at every milepost leading to Charleston as a ghoulish warning that resistance was futile. But when grim public executions no longer satisfied their thirst for vengeance, colonial authorities cracked down on the Black population with severe legal restrictions, creating the Negro Act of 1740. Designed to force the enslaved population into, quote, due subjection and obedience, and also designed to save the public peace and order. It reaffirmed that all Black people are, quote, hereby declared to be and remain forever hereafter absolute slaves. The legislation aimed to go further than any previous form of racial control by authorizing the policing of nearly every aspect of Black people's lives. Now, in establishing their own nation, Haitian rebels had accomplished what scholar Michel Rolfe-Trouillot described as the unthinkable. The Haitian Act of Independence radically upended the basic premise of white supremacy upon which slavery rested and asserted Black people's fundamental human right to liberty and self-governance, thus repudiating prevailing assumptions about who possessed human rights and who did not. The emergence of a sovereign Black nation rising from the ashes of France's most profitable slave colony represented the culmination of white people's deepest fears. After all, if Haiti could have a successful slave rebellion, defeat multiple armies, and then establish a sovereign nation, couldn't the same thing happen elsewhere, perhaps in their very midst? And although the conclusion of the Civil War officially ended chattel slavery, unlike what this image had hoped, the 13th Amendment did not end the formal and informal use of police officers and vigilante posses to control and dominate Black people. Most Southern states quickly passed Black codes, which still scrutinized and governed Black people's movements and empowered the militia and patrols to monitor and punish them for violations. Thinly disguised as anti-vagrancy laws, the laws sought to ensure that Black people could never gain full freedom and equality in the United States. As one Alabama plantation owner wrote, "We have the power to pass stringent police laws to govern the Negroes. This is a blessing, for they must be controlled in some way or white people cannot live amongst them." Worse, the police themselves increasingly operated as a careful blending of slave patrollers and members of the Ku Klux Klan, which terrorized Black people in the aftermath of the Civil War. In fact, the parallels between slave patrols, the KKK, and the police became glaringly apparent, especially to the Black population. In many states, former slave patrollers simply became part of the police force, and police officials often tended to also hold membership in the Klan. Southern police also adopted many of the same strategies that slave patrollers had employed, checking suspicious persons, limiting nighttime movement, and using curfews and vagrancy laws to control, harass, and detain Black citizens. White vigilantes, including the KKK, also assumed the lawless, violent aspects of slave patrols. Operating extra-legally, the Klan kept Black people under constant surveillance, disrupted gatherings they believed posed a threat to white safety, and openly murdered Black people who appeared too rebellious. As a result, most newly freed Black people saw little difference between the brutality of the slave patrols, white Southern policemen, or the Klan. The point here is that although slavery was abolished, the police were not, nor was the quest for white supremacy.
So we wanted to start the year off with this keynote address by Dr. Leslie Alexander because it provides such essential historical knowledge that allowed us to continue addressing the broader theme of the roots of global anti-Blackness. We then sent out a call for works in progress and invited scholars from Rutgers and beyond to think about how this theme connects to their own work. This Works in Progress series supported new scholarship and knowledge production on global anti-Blackness. And we had the pleasure of having 4 incredible participants take part in this series. So for today's event, we asked these 4 participants to reflect on what their research has to say about current struggles against anti-Blackness. Here were their responses.
My project for Insurgent Intersections is drawn from my second book manuscript, provisionally titled Capture, Commodify, and Kill: Ecologies of State Corporate Violence and Racialized Social Control. I used my formal training as a criminologist to study the relationship between state and subject and the criminogenic features of formal social control. Criminal justice systems, which of course include police, courts, and corrections, are among the most visible systems of coercion, but this project also focuses on mobility regimes like immigration laws and policies and how they are financially welded to criminal justice systems and multi-sector capital accumulation projects or large-scale industries that extend far beyond the brick and mortar confines of your jails, prisons, and other institutional settings. My contribution to contemporary scholarship on anti-Blackness is an empirical one, where I emphasize the biographical and institutional trajectories that shaped current paradigms of social control in and beyond the United States. The research for this book began as an inductive grounded theory evaluation of major tech companies that regularly enter contracts with Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the Department of Homeland Security. During the spring and summer months of 2021, 2 research assistants and myself gathered publicly available info on major corporations that have business interests with ICE. And our sources include reports and data repositories from nonprofits, activist organizations, major news outlets, and Inspector General reports from entities like DHS or Homeland Security. And the net result is a database of 403 corporations that directly profit from both migrant detention and incarceration. This text, once finished, will complement existing scholarship and multimedia that challenge all systems of coercion and control where fiduciary interests and profitability are embedded or at the fore. Additionally, I am to use this text to communicate about criminogenic capital and how the dominant political economy continues to capture, commodify, and kill the human subject and the human spirit in ways that the criminological research enterprise has yet to fully recognize.
My work as a part of that larger works in progress group focused on reading a specific moment where Thomas Jefferson, in his famous or infamous Notes on the State of Virginia, elaborates the reasons that enslaved people of African descent could not be emancipated and then integrated within United States society because of a number of explicitly anti-Black racist reasons that he provides. In the elaboration of that theory, this kind of science of the time, if you will, this race science, he names Phyllis Wheatley, who at that point was the first published person of African descent in the United States. She published a collection of poetry, and he names her to note that despite the fact that she has fame and acclaim both in the United States and abroad, what she provides is not poetry. And I argue that in this framework of specific and explicit anti-Blackness, what Jefferson is doing on a larger level is helping to correct for the structure of white cis heteropatriarchy that existed at the time, correct for this challenge that Phyllis Wheatley would provide otherwise through what I'm thinking through is a Black poetics that Wheatley inaugurates. This project seeks, as a larger part of my dissertation and work, to think through how we revisit the histories of the construction and reconstruction of whiteness, masculinity, manhood, and white manhood as a part of the nation building in the United States, and argues that that process is always in opposition to Blackness and specifically Black womanhood, Black femininity, and Black feminist productions of thought. I've appreciated the opportunity to read others' works to continue to think through how my argument about the production of whiteness is always a part of this anti-Black framework that is both defines the history of the United States, but also defines much of the current moment. And I'm hoping that by thinking differently about the history, we can frame the present in a different manner to understand ways outside of the current structures of anti-Black racist logics and technologies.
My project, exact to a nicety in calculations of profit and loss, global anti-Blackness, control science, and the rise of industrial capitalism, explores the creation of an elite discipline for controlling the masses. In response to the turbulent 17th century, which is characterized by revolt and resistance, the commercial, political, and intellectual authorities of the British Atlantic in the 18th century invented new ways to exercise and justify power, developing what I call control science, which brought together everyone from the inventors of the steam engine and the man who discovered oxygen to famous abolitionists like William Wilberforce and government officials. The philosophy of enslavers and the accounting of slave traders were control science's core foundation. These elites' ideas on how to exploit people and why, a cynical worldview that presented humans, again, as isolated individuals and machines driven by interests, can be found today in corporate boardrooms, mainstream economics textbooks, and of course, political discourse. Control science as a concept helps us dismantle anti-Blackness by understanding its foundations and their pervasive legacies. Contemporary capitalism, from McKinsey to McDonald's, owes its structure and governing ideas to 18th century anti-Black ideology. The architects of control science, in other words, were architects of modernity. Control science played a pivotal role in both the rise of prisons and the police who put people in them. Jeremy Bentham, for example, wrote the 1798 legislation that created the first modern police force in London, in tandem with West India merchants, i.e. enslavers. There is a direct line from Victorian workhouses, likewise, deliberately made dismal in order to keep out what were called undeserving claimants, to Reagan's claims of welfare queens. An exploration of control science, in other words, reveals the anti-Blackness behind liberal capitalism that often presented itself as colorblind. This not-so-secret history of the methods of racist capitalism, which ultimately will be a future book, argues for the centrality of racial justice in any struggle for economic or political equality, and attempts to aid in these struggles and struggles against anti-Blackness today by providing a practical history of some critical tactics, strategies, and mindsets that currently uphold it.
My current in-progress manuscript is titled Indigenous Blackness in the Americas, the Queer Politics of Self-Making, Garifuna, New York. It's a transdisciplinary ethnographic study on how transgenerational Garifuna New Yorkers of Central American descent negotiate, articulate, contradict at the intersections of their Blackness, indigeneity, and Central American Caribbeanness. It is a project that really looks into the political, the hemispheric political and cultural activism of Garifuna New Yorkers in their work against white supremacy, against anti-Blackness, but particularly also the very category of Latinidad as an anti-Black project. And it's a project that really gives us a hemispheric as well as a local lens on how Spanish-speaking Black indigenous peoples from Central America's Caribbean coast are constantly negotiating space, negotiating belonging and recognition in multiple spaces that may or may not see them. In this book project, I think about Black Lives Matter and La Vida Negra Importan as a hemispheric project that is always in the service of dismantling anti-Blackness, both in the US and in Latin America and the Caribbean, particularly when we think about Garifuna folks on Central America's Caribbean coast who are constantly in dispossession of their ancestral lands and in dispossession around housing and educational opportunities in Central America, as well as in the United States.
Thank you so, we would really like to thank all the scholars and the participants in our workshops for helping us support new scholarship that explores anti-Blackness in many different ways. And as you can see, we had a great semester. But this is only part of our vision in Insurgent Intersections. It's really important for us not to limit this knowledge or not to limit this knowledge production to the vantage point of the academy. We recognize and value the importance of knowledge, insights, and importantly, solutions that emerge when activism, creative arts, and the knowledge embedded in culture are in conversation with research and scholarship. And most of all, an ongoing conversation with our communities, our multiple communities. As we move into the next part of our program tonight, we're going to be exploring how to get to new epistemologies, new ways of knowing, with scholars who flow between multiple modes of knowledge production. Our first scholar, artist, activist is Dr. Amber Henry, who received her PhD this year in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania, and she is also a proud Rutgers undergraduate alum and one of my very first students. She has traveled extensively in the African diaspora with her dissertation project focused on the Black community of Cartagena, Colombia, and specifically the community of Palenque. This community traces its history back to the Africans who helped build one of the most important port cities of the New World, and also those Africans who escaped to create one of the most enduring settlements of African freedom fighters in the Maroon community that's known as Palenque or San Basilio de Palenque. Amber Henry is joining us live tonight to share some of the ways that multiple centers of knowledge make possible a more extensive and inclusive engagement in the work of combating anti-Blackness. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Amber Henry.
Thank you, Kim, for that fantastic introduction, and it's an honor to be here amidst all of you. Let me share my screen. All right, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Amber Henry, and as Kim said, I'm a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania and soon to be postdoctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African and African American Studies at UVA. My talk today is entitled Inalienable Bodies, the Shifting Face of Anti-Blackness in Colombia. I'll speak for about 7 minutes, and I'm happy to engage any conversation in the Q&A. So when we think about anti-Blackness, we think about statues promoting pro-slavery individuals or colonialism being torn down. We think also about policing and the many ways in which the bodies of Black people in the continent and the diaspora are constantly regulated and controlled via many systems of surveillance and governmentality. But we don't also always think about images like this, images of smiling Black women in colorful uniforms along the walled city of Cartagena, wearing baskets of fruit on their head, or promoting the stall of Colombia at international fairs, such as the one we see on the lower left-hand corner with Eva presenting in Spain. Yet as we push past our traditional modes of viewing anti-Blackness and develop a deeper sensitivity and care to the lives of people who are living even within the spotlight of these many processes of representation, we are able to see how even processes like these are connected to anti-Blackness, as I will share in my brief talk today. So we are located in Cartagena, Colombia, which, as Kim Butler says, is the capital city of the Department of Bolívar along the Caribbean coast of Colombia. So this is the Atlantic coast of South America. And Cartagena is on the coast, whereas the Maroon community of San Basilio de Palenque is located about 60 kilometers inland. Palenque is known as being home to the only Spanish-based Creole in the Americas. Palenqueros speak the language of Palenquera and have traditions such as lumbalú and other gastronomic practices that really signal their connection to Africa, right? So Palenque is dubbed a corner of Africa in Colombia. And yet, even though Palenqueros are celebrated as having the umbilical cord essentially connected to the continent, many Palenqueros experience discrimination and marginalization in a host of ways. So in my talk today, I'd like to think about how scholarship, activism, and the arts can come together to allow us to not only see modes of anti-Blackness in the Colombian Caribbean in really unique ways, but also to address it in a manner that allows us to link together populations of scholars, activists, and also artists in Colombia and abroad. So first I'll speak about scholarship. This work comes from my own ethnographic project in Cartagena, Colombia. I've used ethnography, newspaper archives, engaged research, and audiovisual documentation to work with a group of over 70 Palenquera women who work in and along the Caribbean coast of Colombia. This has involved working on a census with the women, having meetings. We see here on the left, a group of over 40 women convening in a university where we were discussing the issues that they face in their everyday work as street vendors in the walled city of Cartagena. And I've also worked with some historians who have allowed us to uncover the archives that show us the history of Palenquera women working Cartagena and how their work has been received. So some of this historical work has shown that there's been a criminalization of Palenquera women in the archives. Here we see 3 Palenqueras selling along the beaches, along the caption, "The invasion of the beaches." The beaches have been invaded by the Palenquera women, and tourists are left without places to enjoy. What's interesting is that each of the images I'm sharing with you today from my archival research are all sourced from the judicial section of the newspaper. This one in particular discusses the sidewalks of Cartagena being made even smaller by Palenquera women, but it's published in the newspaper alongside the qualms of the city, such as the FARC demanding $70,000 for a kidnapping, 2 people hurt in an accident, and a fire in Cartagena. These images are therefore contextualized within this notion of criminalizing Palenquera women in their occupation of public space and disrupting the flow of the city in ways that frame them as a disturbance to the regular order of Cartagena. In this next political cartoon from 1983, we see a photographer depicting Palenquera women saying, "Smile with these fruits, you all look like stamps." But the woman responds, "When they run us off in the center, we don't look like stamps, but stampedes." Here she's referring to the police violence that routinely affected Palenquera women in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s as they were discouraged from selling in the city. That is made even more evident in the following political cartoon, in which Labor Day was celebrated by Palenquera women and other ambulant vendors, but we see a Palenquera woman here writhing in pain with a bandage on her knee as she screams, "I," holding her empty fruit basket because she's just been brutalized by the police. So all of these methods then show us how there is a historical there's a historical presence of police violence and anti-Black violence directly targeting Palenquera women. So how then does this merge with activism? In 2019, one of the most famous Palenquera women, Angelina Cassiani, was harassed by a police officer, even though she is one of the most famous women who takes a picture every year with Miss Colombia. So here we see her on the right, picture with Miss Colombia, and then on the other side, we see her being harassed by the police. This incident sparked a march where over 1,500 Palenqueras and other sympathizers throughout the city joined to protest anti-Black violence and police harassment against Palenquera women, other Afro-Colombians, and street vendors in the city. Here's an image of Angelina again holding a sign that says "Respect," leading the march. Now, what's interesting about the march is that it was not a typical occurrence in the city of Cartagena, but by dressing in these colorful uniforms, by using the fruit baskets, the women employed upon the visual and the aesthetic representations as a hook upon which to hang their activism. Here I have a short video clip from Maria de los Santos, who's talking about the issue of heritage. And I mentioned this in the opening of my talk today, where I talked about these images of Palenquera women being represented as a calling cards of the nation via the Colombian government. And this is all part of an attempt to represent Palenquera women as what's called intangible heritage. But what was really unearthed with this march is that the notion of heritage, the same concept that's applied to unliving, unbreathing statues, monuments, and castles, when applied to Black women, women who are constantly living under the reality of experiencing multiple subjectivities that are both racialized, gendered, class, and regionalized, that notion of heritage often falls flat. And this is what Maria de los Santos is saying in this following clip.
Porque de nada nos sirve ser patrimonio histórico. Hasta donde yo tengo entendido, ser patrimonio histórico es algo que depende de Cartagena también.
So De Los Santos is saying here that the notion of celebrating Palenquera women, celebrating Afro-Colombians or African descendants in the diaspora, when it is not coupled with real protection, real resources, and real materials, becomes useless. So here we're thinking about how anti-Blackness can emerge even simultaneously as Black people are being promoted as images of tourism, cultural promotion, or intangible heritage. So in this last section, I'll talk a little bit about what it means to merge all these processes with art and digital memes. One is the emergence of this image that was circulated after the police harassment, where one of the images of the founders of Cartagena, Rafael Núñez, was replaced with the statue of a Palenquera woman, really pushing back against what it means to think about this space as not one that is represented by Spanish colonizers, but by people like Palenquera women. And here art is so interesting because Cartagena is not a place where the tearing down of statues is quite happening, but it's through art. It's through this kind of digital remixing that palenqueros and activists and artists were able to push back against the teeming abundance of colonial statues in Cartagena and really push for another vision. This is a meme that was created where we can see how palenquera women were used in the campaign of Vice President Marta Lucía Ramirez in her campaign, but then once she's in government, these same palenquera women become harassed by the police. And then finally, this is a digital piece of art where palenquera woman Angelina Cassiani was kind of replicated in front of many, many people, which is to say that if you mess with one of us, you're messing with all of us. And finally, I produced a documentary film in 2020 along with Angelina Cassiani, which allowed us to really see her in her home life and then also merging through this incident of police violence, and then finally going 8 months later to question what happened. And the video clip that you saw just a moment ago is a clip from that excerpt. So I'd like to close by thinking about what it means then to merge scholarship, activism, and art together as we think about anti-Blackness in the Americas. And here I'd like to bring into the conversation Tina Kampt, who in her new book, A Black Gaze, thinks about what it can do when artists, but particularly Black artists, are using their work to highlight the experiences of Black people. And she calls this a slow ethics of care. Kampt says that artists who slow down our encounters with Blackness are what she's looking at. In so doing, they intensify our understanding of the precarity of Black life in ways that solicit our participation in an alternative ethics of care. Each uses slowness in ways that require us to take care, to take notice, and to amplify how we care for ourselves and others, and how we care for both the living and the dead. So I see this as a wonderful opportunity to think about how scholarship, art, and activism can come together in a way that allow us to honor the lives of Black people by using the slow ethics of care. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amber Henry, and congratulations again on the postdoc fellowship. Yay! That was wonderful. We really do appreciate and admire how your work reflects the importance of engaging art, activism, and scholarship simultaneously to address global anti-Blackness. Speaking of which, I now have the great pleasure of inviting our featured panelists on screen to discuss how their work also engages these intersections of art, activism, and scholarship, and so that we can start considering or continue considering creative solutions to the many manifestations of anti-Blackness worldwide. Our first panelist is Dr. Sara Bruno. Dr. Bruno is the ACLS Emerging Voices Race and Digital Technologies Postdoctoral Fellow at the Franklin Humanities Institute in the Department of Cultural Anthropology at Duke University. Her research and art lie at the intersections of performance, diaspora, and digitality. Welcome, Sarah. Our second panelist is Dr. Priscilla Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira is an assistant professor in geography and Latinx and Caribbean studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. Her research interests lie in the intersections of class, race, and gender in Latin American societies, particularly in Brazil, and their resulting geographical patterns of racialized, uneven economic geographies. Welcome, Priscilla.
Thank you.
Our third panelist is Dr. Prisca Gayles. Dr. Gayles is an assistant professor of sociology and gender, race, and identity studies at the University of Nevada, Reno. She is an interdisciplinary scholar who investigates how emotions matter in understanding transnational Black social movements. Welcome, Prisca. And our final panelist is Dr. Alessandra Williams. Dr. Williams is an assistant professor of dance at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, who researches dance, transnational feminism, and queer performance, as well as African American and Asian American cultures. Welcome, Alessandra. Great. So as we start this conversation, I want to encourage everyone in attendance to add their questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will be opening up the discussion to your questions after a short discussion with the panelists. So welcome again, panelists. And to start us off, I want to ask each of you, how does your current work exist at the intersections of art, activism, and scholarship? Let's start with Sarah.
I think my current work is existing at those intersections because not only as a poet myself, I work on bomba, and I wrote a book of poetry about bomba before grad school was even a thought that was anchored in my mind. And so it was natural for me to want to work with bomberas in my dissertation and now my first ethnographic project. And I think that at the root of it all, my art, my research, the art I encounter as a researcher, and the scholarship I'm producing, which is looking at the history of feelings amongst Afro-Puerto Rican practitioners in bomba, really is about how people stay alive. And I think that is what binds it, all of the politics within that, all of the negotiations and strategies embedded in historical legacies of tradition. So that's my answer for the icebreaker.
Thank you, Sarah. All right, let's pass it along to Priscilla.
Good evening, or good afternoon. Well, I come from a trajectory learning with, walking with popular educators, and also folks working with Theater of the Oppressed. And through that, I've learned so much about how our everyday, or the performance of our existence, is a rehearsal into the dramas and the solutions that we need to experiment. So I feel like everything from how I am constantly trying to ask myself, what makes me come alive, is also a question that I share with my students, and I provoke my people who walk with me to be asking that question. And in that question, the pleasure that I find, that I seek, is to constantly think about how can we create bridges to share the resources that are concentrated within the walls of the intellectual industrial complex, such that it's, co-created and shared in all kinds of ways, not just the materiality of the affect that we share with the people we think with whom we walk, but the actual concreteness of celebrating, the resources, the knowledge, the books, the ideas, the travels, the grants, with the people that we walk with. So I can say more a little bit about how specifically that's been happening, but I'll share the time with the colleagues now.
All right. We will have some time to keep building on this question for sure. All right, Prisca.
Thank you, Shanti. Thank you to everyone for being here. So I think when I thought about this question, I was like, from what angle do I enter the answer to this question? Art, performance art specifically has been such a part of my life. My dad is an artist and musician. I danced since I was 4 until I went to grad school. But and so even when I think about my my research for my current book project, it actually started working with a historian and an ethnomusicologist to study the African roots of tango in Argentina. It was in that capacity that I met the activists that I currently work with and learned about and came to work with and write about Argentina's Black social movement. And so it kind of took me away from thinking about how art, and specifically African diasporic art, has so often functioned as a technology of resistance. And so I think I got away a little bit from the art, but then in coming back to it, over the last few years doing the work, And I'm so glad, Dr. Henry, thank you for mentioning that book, because I had not heard of it, but a lot of my work right now is looking at how art functions as a technology of resistance. And often it is by challenging in a number of ways the white gaze, right? And so one of the ways I'm thinking of that, there's a wonderful dance group that was started by Colleen Fitzgerald, who's from the US, but has lived in Argentina and Liberia, where her mother is from, and started a group called Danza para Mujeres Afro, or Dance for Black Women in Argentina. And really it was a space to come together away from the gaze, because if you're Black and you even walked in Argentina, but dance in Argentina, there's the gaze becomes the touch, becomes the grab, become a violent encounter. The other looking at art and activism and scholarship is through this also wonderful theater group created by Alessandra Williams, who also in Argentina, which is called Theater in Sepia, or Teatro en Sepia. And that is a theater group. So whereas the one is kind of, let's escape the white gaze and have a space where we can do this liberatory movement away from the white gaze. The other one actually kind of knocks it on its head, and it calls upon Argentines to grapple with issues that Black women deal with in Argentina through this theater company, that all of the places they produce, one, are based on true stories, either stories that they've excavated from archives of Black women during the colonial era, anecdotes that they've gotten from interviewing Black women in Argentina, and then staging plays about Black women's experience in Argentina. And so through that way, I'm really looking at how art can function as a technology of resistance. So.
Thank you so much, Prince. And last but certainly not least, Alessandra.
Thank you, Shanti. It's good to be with all of you, my co-panelists. I think for me right now, it's coming through as a collaborator in working alongside Black and Brown women in films. This year, I've had the great honor of finally bringing into fruition my book project, Dancing Transnational Feminisms, with my colleagues Ananya and Hue. And that book is really thinking about the intersection of scholarship and artistry through the lens of Ananya Dance Theater, a dance company based in Minneapolis that is igniting Indian dance for the purposes of telling stories of social justice. And I think what I've learned from that project, because it took 10 years, is what can happen through the invisible, hidden, silenced, unknown labor of Black and Brown women working together. Me as a Black femme and my colleagues from India and China coming together to bring this work into fruition. We would dance together in rehearsal for 4 hours, and then we would go into the next room sweaty and work on our book. And we did that for 10 years. And so I think artistry and scholarship, when they come together, there's a lot of hidden labor that people simply have no idea that's going on to make those intersections happen. And alliances are happening across difference for that work to be intersected.
Yes, I want us to put a pin on that comment, Alessandra, because it's the additional hidden, but also productive labor, right, that occurs in these intersections is really critical. As you mentioned, those 10 years, I was like sweating over here. Oh my God. So before we get back into this question of the intersections, I want you all to kind of jump in and, chat with each other if the spirit moves you. So building off of this year's theme of the roots of global anti-Blackness, I want you to kind of consider with me, what do you think is the importance of addressing the historical context underlying today's struggles against anti-Blackness? And if it applies, does this, come up in your work at all? Anyone can contribute.
I think I will start because so much of my work has been about people don't believe you about racism in Argentines, or a lot of people don't, unless you tie it to that history. So much of my work, I've written entire articles on a contemporary moment, Black women's experience in the feminist movement, and gotten back from reviews like, you need to connect this Black people in Argentina historically, because for so long it was not talked about. And so I think that there's two things. One, it is important because often the contemporary moment is so tied to the historical context. Whether it is common assumptions that we have, stereotypes that we have, are often tied to histories of anti-Blackness. And so that's one reason, but I also think it is important, and I think the work that I do, the work that not only I do in Argentina, but the way in my own family we think about how our history is so much part of our present is very important to do. And so when I interview women in Argentina, a lot of them don't talk about, like, thinking about who are the people who influence you. They're talking about their ancestors, not just their current, like, mother, grandmother, great grandmother, but they're talking about their ancestors who they haven't met in the present form, right? And so I think it is important, and that it's gonna kind of tie in a little bit to one of the questions, but it's important as a politics of care to recognize how important our history is, but at the same time to bring that history to the fore, which is so often been buried, been erased, been redacted, been rewritten. And so it's so important to thinking about the current moment to visualize that history. So I'll stop there, but I can keep talking forever.
I think I can add, thank you for that as well, thinking about ancestors, and in Puerto Rico and Bomba, they call them mayores. And I think for me, the historical context of anti-Blackness is tethered to the idea that, again, racism doesn't exist, but more than that, if I center Bomba in the history of Puerto Rico, what happens, right? Jose Luis Gonzalez says that the Black Puerto Ricans who danced Bomba were the first real Puerto Ricans. And if I use that as fact and look at the oldest genre of Puerto Rican music to map out a cartography of, like, femme feeling in Puerto Rico, how does that shift the landscape of contemporary narratives? And so in the Batey and the dance circle, I argue that it's untethered to linear time or space, as the bateyas are popping up in the diaspora, even digitally in the age of COVID. But more than that, I think Sandra Ruiz's argument that Ricanness is affixed to the condition of a constant temporal looping, that colonialism renders us in a loop, meaning that the past impacts the present, and the task of the contemporary is to reckon with the historical legacies. It really makes me think about, and Bomba allows me to think about the bodily knowledge that can help point us in theoretical discourse. So the idea of a dancer coming into a batey, dance circle, where each rhythm in Bomba has a different emotional expectancy, and there's a different movement, grammar of movement that you do with each rhythm. So a dancer has to know them all and then execute them and be recognizable. And for me, that lets me know if we're going to discuss decolonization in the present, we also have to know the metrics and meters and the limits and measures of the ways that empire entangles us all. And for me, it's looking at the choreography of empire and how it comes back over and over again, and the ways that it adjusts to kind of anticipate or hide its secrets, like how entangled is Puerto Rico with the United States, right? So for me, it's understanding the history of when that started, which looks in the wake of Hurricane Maria very recently. But as I continue to do archival research, I see that these entanglements as far as, like, prisons and sentencings, and even how in the court of law, you have to be able to argue in English and in Spanish. That goes back until like the early 1900s, I mean like 1902. So it's not something new that's happening as more political unrest is happening. It's just people are really, really getting fed up. So I think that understanding the past and the historical legacy of anti-Blackness and really the ways in which white supremacy is this constant metronome that Black people have to kind of riff over to continue to survive and live is incredibly important to our contemporary discussions of abolition and decolonization.
I really appreciated what you said, Dr. Bruno, about reckoning with the historical context. And I think that that's so important. I think what I think about is how thinking about that history is about tracing our survival, that we have survived, that we are surviving, and that we will survive. And part of what we do in dance, in the arts, is to shape visions of hope, to shape visuals of the future. We're doing a type of futuristic work to think about what's possible that we're not yet seeing. And in order to do that, we have to understand how we have survived. And I think that's critical right now, especially because our young people, our young Black people are killing themselves. And so our young people need to be able to see that there is a future for them. They need to be able to create that visuals of their lives in the future. They need to be able to do that artistic, creative, hopeful work, that futuristic work in their minds, in their consciousness. And they can't do that if we're not always thinking about how we have survived.
Yes, a lot of my time, my work, I keep constantly thinking about Black community economies and just thinking about the ways that, as Dr. Alexander said before, that, you know, at the root of anti-Blackness is a fear of Black liberation. And I would add it's a fear of Black pleasure. And a lot of the Black community economies, when we think about them, they are mostly centered on resourcefulness in the ways of either confronting a false created experience and also sense of scarcity, and also reclaiming moments and conditions and exchanges to reclaim pleasure. So I think, you know, Amber was talking about, you know, kind of the ways to think about heritage. Black, you know, it's not just about a dead, unesthetic figure, you know, image, but about sort of the liveliness of inheritance of you know, heritage. And when I think about kind of the intersections of art, scholarship, it always comes to mind this cartoon that I saw. It's called The Education Paradigms. And there's a way that the scholar was framing to say that in the current education paradigm, and I would say scholarship, academia, in a way, it's created as sort of an unesthetic experience. So the aesthetic being, you know, feeling alive, being present, which we usually connect with the idea of arts, creativity, attention, presence. And the education paradigm have now been unesthetic. So like, you know, your senses are killed, are paralyzed. And so when I'm thinking about these connections and what's at the root of, you know, sort of anti-Blackness, I usually think about just like how this entire, you know, global like anti-Black context is one that, you know, centers excess. And so some, particularly, you know, whiteness and white vigilantism within, you know, academia and all of the spaces, a lot of its experience is about feeling entitled to excess. And excess, you know, and policing where the resources go, where they end up. And, you know, in a way, and also believing that excessiveness, whether it's excessive resources, of titles, of, you know, of like professional, you know, development, of like, you know, all kinds of, you know, concentrations of power, is a way that it kind of organizes it in a way that it contains and reduces pleasure, controls our time, and distorts our senses of enoughness. So when like I think of activism, we are usually thinking about enough. So either we're saying what we have is not enough, or there should be enough for everybody, or enough of this. Activism is around the idea of enough. So it's in confrontation with all the excesses, right? Pleasure being like arts or, you know, entertainment, and, you know, and time usually related to scholarship. Like we don't have enough time for either pleasure or enoughness, or fighting for what's not enough. You know, so I think for me, remembering the sense of enoughness, of pleasure, and reframing time is one way that this intersection, that we can practice this intersection, whether it's a slow scholarship or, you know, reclaiming leisure time, or just saying, I have time. I do have time, and create time to say I have time. I think that's, you know, whether it's time for us to work with our people, our students, our organizers, or to put our arts together. I think reconnecting those pleasure, a sense of time, and enoughness is what's at this intersection.
Thank you so much, y'all. That was just beautiful. So I want to quickly ask this question because we do have some questions in the Q&A, but I do want to get to this final question because I think it's the most important. We all know, I think everyone in attendance probably knows, that conventional forms of knowledge production in spaces like the universities where we work tend to be anti-Black in nature, and are always anti-Black in nature by their inception, right? And so how can we create new forms of knowledge that kind of taps on those intersections of art, activism, and scholarship that get us closer to social justice? And some of you have already kind of talked about this. But yeah, how can we create, you know, new forms of knowledge by tapping into those intersections?
I think something that I've been really trying to meditate on recently is how to work intergenerationally. And I think that that's something that we tend to forget. Something about social media just kind of, it's just, we're not living in that, even though that's such a deep Africanist Black practice. And for me this year, it's been really important to find ways for that to be pedagogic. And so who are the Black students in my class? And how can I listen to them? And how can I be in the moment so that I have a type of fluidity and a type of deep understanding of my pedagogy so that I can adapt to what they're experiencing? And I've had my Black students do some incredible things, to talking to me about moments where they need to slow down, moments where they need to be reminded of material. And what that has done is to create a better space for everyone. And I think that that's something that's so important because that's our history. When we pay attention to what Black people are experiencing and we make changes, those changes are good for everybody. That's the history of civil rights in this country. And so I think that that's important. And I think too, continuing that deep, deep listening of our elders. And that's something that's hard to do now because we're so captured by being online in a certain way. And an example that I think that resonates with me right now is I was visiting my mother in Louisiana, and we were driving around, and I was like, "Oh, Mom, have you been to that theater?" And she's like, "Oh yeah, I went there as a young person back when it was segregated, and I sat in the colored section." I learned that about my mom last month, and I talk to my mom every single day. And so I think that if we can do that deep work of listening to our elders, that which takes humility, which takes commitment, which takes time, which takes energy, which takes slowing down, which takes being consistent, that it will do that work of understanding anti-Blackness in a very deep, deep personal way. And it also helps us to carry that language over to our students as well, and to live at that intersection of generations.
I think that was beautifully put, and the note about pedagogy is one that I've been thinking about as well. I know when I was taking Bomba classes with different elders, I always got corrected, and it was so embarrassing at times. But it was like a moment, even on Zoom, when we had to transfer to dance class on Zoom, I always got yelled at about bending my knees, like not bending them deep enough. All the way from San Juan, she saw me not bending my knees in my mom's sala in Chicago. And I remember just feeling embarrassed, but I was like, my mom's like, "Ooh, she got you." And I was like, "Oh, it's just because she cares. She doesn't want me to be embarrassed when I go into the buffet." And I kept thinking about that, like caring so much. And this Mayor in particular, she organizes demonstrations, Bomba demonstrations on the International Day Against Women's Violence. She hosted buffets outside of the governor's mansion when they ousted Rosselló. And she takes that same type of like corrective care, and she applies it in a way where she expects people to see her care and the correction and be responded to. And for me, teaching after not teaching in person for like 3 years almost, it was really important for me to not get frustrated and instead explain, like, I care, so I want you to understand this, or I want you to tell me how you will understand this better. Do you need visuals? Do you need kinetic activities in the course? And I think it's that idea of applying a corrective care, even in activism or where scholarship can propel activism. It's really generative for me right now. And I've been thinking more about that and how, even as a learner, what it means to be corrected is a space that I want to lean into more and continue to be humbled in that way, kind of, because it's scary to be humbled, but to sit there and really think about what that means for me after the moment, right? So thank you for bringing up pedagogy.
Yeah, I'll add, yes, I want to echo about the importance of talking about pedagogy here. I've been having conversation with some grad students in my department and be asking them like, okay, what's your expectation of reading for like each course? You know, and they're like, well, like, you know, a book and maybe like an article per week. And how many courses are you taking? Like 3? So like, if we do the math, that's like 1,000 pages a week. And I've been telling them, you know, it's either someone is fooling someone or everybody's fooling everybody. So like, you know, talking about this like pedagogical honesty in terms of expectation and again, excess, the ways that we reperform, right? This notion of excessiveness, like accumulating reading, accumulating exams, accumulating, you know, and like the fast track, you need to like be published in your 3rd year and then you need to be like, you know, and then I think that creates a lot of like disconnect between our ability to cultivate, you know, love and pleasure and sensibilities and creativity for even us to snap back into these connections. So I think one thing that I've been practicing, and I usually like also often talk to my colleagues about this as like now I'm is my first year as an assistant professor, and then I think of myself as an insistent professor. because I'm insisting on trying to frame this path not as and I've said it, Shanti has heard me say this before, I'm insistent professor, and I'm insisting on thinking and living this path, you know, not as a tenure track, but as a tender track. And so that requires me to, you know, to have that same honesty with all of the people I'm in community with, inside and outside the walls, right, of like this industry. And one of the things, you know, thinking about time again, how can we reframe it and, you know, talk about, say, deadlines, you know? I usually, when we're thinking about the roots of global anti-Blackness, we're really talking about genocide and feminicide. And so we're talking about death. And deadlines, that's the origins of deadlines, you know? And so can we talk about alive lines, ongoing lines? Can we talk about, you know, flexibility, spaciousness? That's how we reclaim the space, when we are like, well, you know, why have one date of exam for all the students, and then we're all suppressed and have no time for no activism because we have all these things to grade at once? It's like, how much time do you need to finish your paper, up until when there's a limit for you and I? How can we organize as a team to have ongoing, like, you know, alive lines to suit people's mental health at this point? And so I think creating that flexibility opens up the space for us to reimagine the ways that we can actually do it ourselves justice, to respond to what's dear to our heart, which is like, you know, just co-create in communion, basically, you know, not being the idea of like, I need to give back to my community. Give back is like, if you're not taking it away, you don't need to give it back, but you need to be put. And think about, it's not just about, you know, I've talked about this before, it's not just about the output for like unit of time. The more output, the more productive. It's like, it's either, again, publish or perish. Again, there's a death-driven framing. How can we think about flourishing together and then publishing? How can we share that spaciousness with our people, with ourselves, you know? So I think that's what's the intersection. I think timeliness is so key. And our Orishas and our ancestors, they got this pedagogy.
Can I just jump in? I know we need to take questions now, but so a few things that Priscilla said touched on what I wanted to mention. It was just about thinking about how we envision our visions for collaborations with artists, with activists, and scholarship in the form of knowledge production. That's already happening, and so I think the vision needs to not be about how to do it, but that notion of insistence, and really kind of. And I think, and sometimes you'll see things break through. The fact that we are here in this panel is because some dope ass professors insisted on creating this project, right? I was thinking about A.D. Carson's 2020, I Used to Dream. I Used to Love to Dream. That's a hip hop mixtape that was published by an academic press. But that is a person who was very, very insistent about their hip hop pedagogy not having to conform to that conventional way of knowledge production, just through the pen, because Black people theorize with our bodies, with our voices. When Sada was talking about the knees, I was smiling so big because I remember when I was taking West African dance, and my Ghanaian teacher said, you have to bend your knees because this whole dance is about your rootedness and connectedness to the earth. So we started every single dance class off bouncing our knees. And so I think that work is already happening. We have to be insistent about pushing through kind of the boundaries of white supremacy in academia and in basically the way that knowledge production is recognized.
Thank you so much. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, that just reminded me of being in an African dance class with Alessandra at Macalester College, and that being the same advice. Bend those knees because you have to be rooted in the earth. And it was just, yeah, just came in. So I want to invite back for our last, few minutes here. I want to invite Dr. Amber Henry to join us again, and I want to invite my colleague and co-lead of Insurgent Intersections, Akisi Britton, to give us a couple questions. And I see that Amber has her hand up, so if Amber, you wanted to ask a quick question, go for it.
Sure, thank you. I'm so fed by the conversation that my co-panelists are sharing, and I want to offer my own thoughts on the question that you posed, Shanti, about how can we do this? How to merge academia, art, scholarship. I love the invitation to think about transgenerational connection, and I'd like to bring into the room this notion of full-bodied witnessing and presence with others. So what it means to open our senses and to really be with others. And this is especially relevant in the field of visual anthropology, where we have this kind of ocular-centric notion of difference, where we're focusing on what we see, right? What we see, the images and the pictures and the dance and the folklore. But what does it mean to just open ourselves up to all of our senses in how we experience and accompany others? And I want to bring in a question by Sarah Orsak in the Q&A, who asked specifically if we could talk more about care and how care emerges as a methodology. And one thing that comes to mind from my own ethnographic work in Cartagena, Colombia, was my time just circulating around the walled city and being with the women who, as they were working and selling fruits. And one woman in particular always asked me to come back. If I saw her early in the day, she said, okay, you're leaving, so when are you coming back? And if I came at the end of the day, she said, stick around, I'm almost gonna leave. And at first I treated that petition with a sense of urgency, like she must have something to say, to do, like, let me go. And I realized after a while that she just wanted me to hang out, right? That just being with her without an agenda and allowing life to unfold in whatever form it wanted to unfold that particular day was a way that I could practice care in that space. And as scholars and activists and engaged scholars, there can often be a temptation to act and to try to see the political and to connect that to something larger. But as Kevin Kwesi reminds us in his fabulous work, The Sovereignty of Quiet, all Black life is political, but not all Black life is in protest. To think so is to reduce Black life to always kind of being in counter position to something else. So to be present with Black life, senses, feeling in every way possible, I think is a wonderful kind of pedagogy of thinking about how to do that. So stillness, pause, quiet, interiority are some of the ideas that motivate my own methodology in terms of how to bring together art, scholarship, and activism.
I'm gonna jump in here and with one last question. Do we have time?
Yeah.
Okay, so Amber answered this in the Q&A, but I thought it was a question that we could definitely give to the panelists, especially because it's my area of expertise. Elmina Bell asks, thank you all for being here. I'm wondering if you have insights to share on how ancestral African traditional religions in the diaspora, such as Candomblé, Lukumi, and Vodou, etc., help liberation and fuels arts movements? I love that question.
Thank you for that. I would just add that Africanist practices are rooted in juxtaposition, in conflict, in opposites coming together. That's part of what we learn from Robert Ferris Thompson, for example, African Art in Motion, that we have to be thinking about conflicting forces coming together to create this democratic whole. And for me as an artist, that's something that's been a really central value of mobilization, of mobilizing bodies. Something that I have had the opportunity to do is to write about my teacher, Ananya, and her collaboration with an African-American Afro-diasporic artist named Lori Carlos, who brings this Afro-diasporic theatrical practice to meet this South Asian Indian dance practice. And part of what I've learned from watching them is that we don't have to mobilize and be activated around sameness. We can be mobilized around conflict, because I learned from those two that they, in fact, do not agree on anything at all, ever. They don't agree about race, they don't agree about gender, and yet here they are working together. Something beautiful can still be created when we don't agree, when we disagree, when we conflict constantly. Our work is to work through that, to work through those oppositionary forces, to be democratic.
And with that, I am going to, in our last 1 minute, I'm going to kick it back to Kim as she closes us out.
I am really going to have to contain myself because this is so rich, so good. If I start, I will never finish to start talking about that. But that's good because this is only the beginning. This is really just the beginning. And I just want to thank everybody who was here tonight. Panelists, you know, our minds are just going with all the things that you shared. And all the possibilities. I will confess to everybody that we really just kind of stepped out there as we were trying to think about trying to do something different. We had no idea really what was going to come of it, but we are so happy that we did it. And we're so happy where, you know, all the places that you all are going and opening up. And we really look forward to being with you all moving forward. So let me go to the more formal written part. Thank you, everyone, for making tonight such a wonderful opportunity to reflect back on the roots of global anti-Blackness and to think about how to get to new and more inclusive ways to combat it. As I've just said, this is just the first year. We will be back next year when our theme is going to be the mechanisms of global anti-Blackness. So starting in fall of this year, 22, we're going to be looking at the systems and structures that undergird anti-Blackness today in ways that are often less visible than the blatant violence of slavery and Jim Crow, but nonetheless so pervasive and insidious that is even sometimes practiced unknowingly by its victims. We're interested in exploring the politics of racial geographies, anti-Black technologies, environmental and food justice, immigration systems and policies, and more with leading emerging and established scholars. We're also continuing in our quest to bring in, you know, our ancestral knowledge, our communal knowledge, our artists, our activists in thinking through these issues. We want you to be a part of this project because it is truly about producing knowledge and solutions in community. So we're putting some information in the chat so you could find us on our website. That was supposed to be me, but community. I'm gonna.
Okay,
all right, community.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. So we have information there so to get you in touch with us via our website, so you can find us. You can see the full keynote address by Dr. Leslie Alexander, which was amazing. And you can learn more about our projects and our work. We're also going to be posting information soon about how you can be part of our next round of works in progress workshops. And you can also make sure not to miss any of our events by getting on our mailing list. We are really excited about what's coming, and we look forward to having you with us. So on behalf of our entire team at Insurgent Intersections and the Department of Africana Studies, thank you again for being a part of this evening and being a partner in the work of social justice. Good night, and we'll see you in the fall.